The morning sun cast long shadows across the riverside shooting range as Harold "Hawk" Morrison stepped out of his old pickup truck. At 75 years old, his movements were deliberate but steady, each step carrying the weight of decades spent perfecting his craft. The leather gun case in his weathered hands had seen better days, its brass corners worn smooth from countless competitions and hunting trips. The younger shooters at the range barely glanced his way as he walked toward the registration table. To them, he was just another old-timer trying to relive his glory days. They couldn't know that the man shuffling past them had once held 3 national championships and had taught marksmanship to military personnel during the Vietnam era. Harold had been away from competitive shooting for over a decade, choosing to spend his retirement years fishing and tending to his small farm outside town. But today was different. Today, Harold was answering a challenge that had been eating at him for months. His grandson Jake, now 28, and a rising star in the competitive shooting circuit, had mentioned during their last family dinner that the current generation of marksmen were far superior to the old-timers. "Granddad, with all respect, the game has evolved. The equipment is better. The techniques are more refined. You guys were good for your time, but..." The comment had stung more than Harold cared to admit. Not because it was malicious. Jake respected his grandfather deeply, but because Harold wondered if it might be true. Had the sport really passed him by? Were his steady hands and keen eye no match for modern technology and training methods? The registration clerk, a young woman with bright purple hair and multiple piercings, looked up from her clipboard with barely concealed impatience. "Name and division?" she asked, already reaching for the beginner's forms. "Harold Morrison." "Open division," he replied quietly. Her fingers paused above the paperwork. "Open division? Sir, that's our most competitive category. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer—" "Open division," Harold repeated, his voice carrying a hint of the authority that had once commanded respect on military training grounds. As he filled out the forms, Harold could hear whispered conversations from nearby competitors. Words like "crazy old coot" and "someone's going to get hurt" drifted his way. He understood their concern. The open division attracted the best shooters in the state, men and women in their prime who trained daily and used the latest equipment. Most participants were decades younger than Harold, their reflexes sharp and their confidence unshakable. Harold made his way to the practice area, setting down his case on a weathered wooden bench. When he opened it, several nearby shooters couldn't help but stare. Inside lay a rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a modern competition. The Winchester Model 70 had been his companion for over 40 years, its wooden stock bearing the scars of countless expeditions and competitions. The scope, while well-maintained, was clearly from another era. "Is that thing even legal for competition?" one young shooter asked his friend, pointing toward Harold's rifle. Harold methodically began his preparation routine, the same ritual he had performed thousands of times before. He cleaned the already spotless barrel, checked and double-checked his scope settings, and carefully loaded his ammunition. Each movement was precise and purposeful, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought might have hesitated. The practice rounds didn't go well. Harold's first few shots were scattered, missing the center rings by margins that would have embarrassed him in his prime. His breathing felt rushed, his stance uncertain. The years of inactivity had taken their toll, and for a moment, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. A group of younger competitors had gathered nearby, ostensibly to practice but clearly more interested in watching the old man struggle. Their barely suppressed smirks and exchanged glances weren't lost on Harold. He had seen that look before during his military days when fresh recruits thought they knew better than their instructors, but Harold had learned long ago that pressure was a choice. He could either let the whispers and stares affect his performance, or he could do what he had always done best: focus on the fundamentals. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to remember the lessons that had made him a champion decades ago. The rifle felt heavy in his hands, heavier than he remembered. His shoulders ached from holding the position, and his eyes took longer to focus through the scope. But gradually, shot by shot, something began to click. The muscle memory was still there, buried beneath years of disuse but not forgotten. By the end of his practice session, Harold's shots were grouping closer to the center. Not championship-level shooting, but respectable enough to avoid complete embarrassment. As he packed up his equipment, he noticed that the whispers had died down somewhat. The younger shooters were still skeptical, But they were no longer laughing. Harold walked back to his truck as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The official competition wouldn't begin for another hour, giving him time to collect his thoughts and prepare mentally for what lay ahead. He sat in the cab of his pickup staring at his hands. They were steady enough, though not as rock-solid as they once were. The calluses from decades of shooting had softened, and his trigger finger felt slightly stiff. But something else was stirring inside Harold Morrison, something that had been dormant for years. It wasn't just pride or stubbornness, though both were certainly present. It was the quiet confidence of a man who had spent a lifetime proving that skill trumped youth, that experience could overcome raw talent, and that sometimes the old ways were still the best ways. The competition began with the precision rifle event, where shooters had to hit targets at varying distances under strict time constraints. Harold watched as the first group of competitors took their positions, their high-tech rifles gleaming under the afternoon sun. Carbon fiber stocks, electronic triggers, and scopes that cost more than his first car were the norm, rather than the exception. Marcus Chen, the defending state champion, was scheduled to shoot in the same group as Harold. At 32, Marcus was considered the gold standard for precision shooting in the region. His custom-built rifle was a work of art, every component carefully selected and tuned for maximum accuracy. He had been featured in shooting magazines and had sponsorship deals with major equipment manufacturers. "Look at Grandpa's antique," Marcus whispered to his training partner, nodding toward Harold's Winchester. "I wonder if that scope even has enough magnification to see the targets clearly." Harold overheard the comment but said nothing. He had learned decades ago that the loudest voices at the range rarely belonged to the best shooters. True champions let their targets do the talking. He continued his methodical preparation, checking his data book where he had recorded decades of environmental conditions, wind patterns, and bullet trajectories. The range officer called for the first group to take their positions. Harold found himself on firing point 7, between Marcus on his left and a young woman named Sarah Rodriguez on his right. Sarah was known for her aggressive shooting style and quick target transitions. She barely acknowledged Harold's presence, focused entirely on her own equipment setup. As Harold settled into his shooting position, he could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him. Spectators had gathered behind the firing line, many drawn by word that an elderly competitor was attempting to challenge the state's best shooters with what appeared to be vintage equipment. Some watched with genuine curiosity, others with barely concealed amusement. The targets were set at 300 yards, a distance that would test both accuracy and the shooter's ability to read wind conditions. Harold peered through his scope, noting the subtle movement of grass and leaves that indicated wind direction and speed. It was a skill that had taken him years to master, long before computerized ballistic calculators could provide instant solutions. "Shooters, you have 30 minutes to engage all targets," announced the range officer. "Begin when ready." The sound of rifle bolts being cycled echoed across the range as competitors loaded their first rounds. Harold took his time, settling into a comfortable position that his body remembered despite the years away. His breathing slowed naturally, each exhale bringing him deeper into the focused state that had once made him nearly unbeatable. Marcus was the first to fire, his shot breaking the relative silence with a sharp crack. Sarah followed quickly. Then other competitors joined in with a steady rhythm of gunfire. Harold remained motionless, his eye pressed to the scope, waiting for the perfect moment when his breathing, heartbeat, and the rifle's natural point of aim aligned. When Harold finally squeezed the trigger, the recoil felt familiar and comforting, like greeting an old friend. Through his scope, he watched the bullet's impact through the spotting scope positioned beside each firing point. The shot hit just inside the 9 ring, close to the center but not quite the precision he was hoping for. Around him, other competitors were firing rapidly, taking advantage of every second available. Marcus had already engaged 4 of the 6 required targets, each shot finding the center rings with mechanical precision. Sarah was keeping pace, her shooting style aggressive but effective. Harold continued his deliberate approach, taking time to read the wind before each shot. His second round hit closer to center, and his third found the 10 ring. Gradually, the rhythm of competition came back to him. The external pressure faded as his world narrowed to the fundamentals: sight picture, breathing, trigger control. but it was clear that his methodical pace was putting him at a disadvantage. While his shots were becoming more accurate, he was falling behind in the time management aspect of the competition. Modern competitive shooting demanded not just precision but speed, and Harold's patient approach was better suited to an era when time limits were more generous. With 10 minutes remaining, Harold had engaged only 4 of his 6 targets, while most other competitors were finishing their final shots. The spotters were announcing scores as shooters completed their strings of fire. Marcus had posted an impressive 584 out of a possible 600 points. Sarah finished with 571. Other competitors were clustering in the 550-570 range. Harold's pulse quickened as he realized the time pressure. For a moment, the old instincts kicked in, and he considered rushing his final 2 shots. But something his first shooting instructor had told him 50 years ago echoed in his mind. Better to make 2 perfect shots than 6 mediocre ones. He settled back into his position, blocking out the countdown being called by the range officer. His 5th shot took nearly 2 minutes to execute, but when it broke, Harold knew it was good even before seeing the spotting scope. The bullet hole appeared dead center in the 10 ring. 5 minutes remaining, called the range officer. Harold had 1 shot left. Around him, other competitors were packing up their equipment, their competitions complete. A small crowd had gathered behind his position, drawn by the unusual sight of someone still shooting with such deliberate precision, while others had finished. The wind had shifted slightly, requiring Harold to adjust his point of aim. He made the correction based on decades of experience reading environmental conditions, trusting his instincts over any technological aid. The final shot felt perfect from the moment he began the trigger press to the moment the rifle recoiled against his shoulder. When the target was pulled and scored, Harold's final shot had hit the X ring, the innermost portion of the 10 ring reserved for only the most precise shots. His total score of 568 points placed him 3rd overall in the first event, ahead of several shooters half his age and behind only Marcus and 1 other competitor. The silence that followed the score announcement was profound. Harold could feel dozens of eyes on him as he began cleaning his rifle, the same methodical process he had performed countless times before. The whispers and smirks from earlier had been replaced by genuine respect and curiosity. Word of Harold's performance in the first event spread quickly through the shooting community. During the lunch break, competitors who had previously ignored him began approaching with questions about his technique and equipment. Many were genuinely puzzled by how someone using what they considered outdated gear could compete at such a high level. "That's some impressive shooting, sir," said Marcus Chen, extending his hand to Harold. "I have to ask, what's your secret?" "That rifle looks like it's older than most of the people here." Harold accepted the handshake with a slight smile. "Experience mostly. This old gun and I have been through a lot together. We understand each other." Sarah Rodriguez joined the conversation, her earlier dismissiveness replaced by genuine curiosity. "The way you read the wind was incredible. You were making corrections I didn't even see the need for, but your shots kept getting better while mine started drifting." A small group had formed around Harold's bench as he cleaned his rifle for the afternoon events. Younger shooters peppered him with questions about his background, his training methods, and his shooting philosophy. Harold found himself enjoying the attention, though he remained modest about his achievements. "I competed back when shooters had to develop their skills without computer assistance," Harold explained, running a cleaning patch through his rifle barrel. "We learned to read conditions by watching grass, feeling the wind on our faces and understanding how temperature and humidity affected our bullets. Modern technology is amazing, but sometimes the old ways still work." Jake Morrison, Harold's grandson, arrived at the range during the lunch break. He had heard about his grandfather's morning performance through the shooting community's informal network and had driven 2 hours to watch the afternoon events. When he found Harold surrounded by admirers, Jake felt a mixture of pride and amazement. "Granddad, I can't believe you didn't tell me you were competing today," Jake said, giving his grandfather a warm embrace. "Mom called me after Mrs. Henderson saw your name in the local paper's sports section," Harold chuckled. "I wasn't sure I'd embarrass myself or not. Figured it was better to keep it quiet until I knew how rusty I really was." The afternoon would bring 2 more challenging events: rapid fire at shorter distances and a final long-range precision stage that would test every aspect of a marksman's skill. Harold's strong showing in the morning had established him as a serious contender, but the younger competitors weren't ready to concede anything. The rapid-fire event began at 2 o'clock. Shooters had to engage multiple targets at distances ranging from 100 to 200 yards, with strict time limits that left no room for the deliberate approach Harold had used in the morning. This was where youth and quick reflexes typically dominated, and many expected Harold's age to finally show. Harold positioned himself at the firing line, acutely aware that this event would likely expose the limitations that came with being 75 years old. His reactions weren't as quick as they once were, and his eyes took longer to acquire targets through the scope. But as the range officer explained the course of fire, Harold felt a familiar calm settling over him. The secret, he realized, wasn't trying to match the young shooter's speed. It was about efficiency. Every movement had to count. Every transition between targets had to be smooth and purposeful. He would have to shoot smarter, not faster. When the buzzer sounded, Harold moved with deliberate precision. While other shooters swung their rifles quickly between targets, Harold's movements were fluid and economical. He lost precious seconds on target acquisition, but he gained them back by requiring fewer shots to achieve the required hits. Marcus Chen was shooting 2 positions down from Harold, his transitions between targets lightning quick. His expensive equipment allowed for rapid target engagement, and his youth provided the reflexes needed to excel in this type of competition. But Harold noticed that Marcus was rushing some of his shots, sacrificing accuracy for speed. Halfway through the course of fire, Harold had fallen behind on time, but was ahead on points. His shots were finding their marks with consistency, while some of the faster shooters were accumulating penalty points for marginal hits. The crowd watching from behind the firing line was captivated by the contrast in shooting styles. With 30 seconds remaining, Harold faced his final 2 targets. Other competitors were already packing their equipment, having completed the course with time to spare. The pressure was enormous, but Harold had faced similar situations countless times during his competitive career. He settled into position on his penultimate target, forcing himself to trust his instincts rather than rush the shot. The bullet struck the scoring zone cleanly. 1 target remained with 15 seconds on the clock. Harold's final target required a 30-yard transition and a precise shot on a smaller scoring zone. As he swung his rifle toward the target, Harold felt his age for the first time all day. His shoulders ached from the shooting positions, and his eyes were beginning to fatigue from hours of intense focus through the scope. But muscle memory took over. The rifle settled into position naturally. His breathing slowed automatically, and his finger found the trigger's sweet spot without conscious thought. With 3 seconds remaining on the clock, Harold fired his final shot. The result was announced minutes later after all targets had been scored. Harold's final shot had struck the 10 ring, giving him a total score that placed him second overall in the rapid-fire event. Only Marcus had shot better, and by a margin of just 2 points. The transformation in how other competitors viewed Harold was remarkable. Conversation stopped when he walked by, not out of ridicule but out of respect. Younger shooters asked for his autograph and wanted pictures with him. The legend was no longer just an old man with an outdated rifle. He was a master craftsman demonstrating that skill and experience could compete with youth and technology. But the day's final event would be the ultimate test. The long-range precision stage would push every competitor to their limits, and Harold knew that his morning's success had painted a target on his back. The younger shooters would be gunning for him, eager to prove that his early success was just beginner's luck. The final event of the day would separate the true marksman from the merely talented. Targets were positioned at 600 yards, a distance where even small errors in judgment or technique would result in complete misses. The wind was picking up as afternoon turned toward evening, creating challenging conditions that would test every shooter's ability to read environmental factors. Harold studied the conditions carefully, watching the movement of flags positioned at various distances downrange. The wind was gusting and changing direction, creating a puzzle that would require all of his decades of experience to solve. Younger competitors were consulting handheld weather stations and ballistic computers, while Harold relied on methods that had served him since before such technology existed. "This is where the old man finally meets his match," whispered one competitor to another, apparently forgetting that Harold's hearing was still quite sharp. 600 yards in these conditions? He'll be lucky to hit the target frame. Marcus Chen was checking and rechecking his equipment, clearly feeling pressure after Harold's unexpectedly strong performance throughout the day. The defending champion had expected to dominate the competition, but finding himself in a genuine contest with a 75-year-old shooting vintage equipment had rattled his confidence. Sarah Rodriguez approached Harold as he prepared for the final stage. "Mr. Morrison, I have to ask, how do you read wind conditions without any modern instruments? I've been using every piece of technology available, and I'm still struggling with these gusts." Harold smiled and pointed toward the various indicators downrange. "See that flag at 300 yards? It's showing a left-to-right wind of about 8 miles per hour. But look at the grass movement at 400 yards. It's indicating a crosswind component that's not showing on the closer flags. The secret is understanding that wind rarely moves in straight lines." He continued his explanation, genuinely enjoying the opportunity to teach. "Your computers can tell you what the wind is doing right now, but they can't predict what it will be doing when your bullet arrives downrange. That takes experience and intuition." As shooters took their positions for the final event, the gallery of spectators had grown considerably. Word had spread beyond the range about the elderly competitor who was challenging the state's best shooters. Local media had arrived, and photographers were positioning themselves to capture what had become an unexpectedly compelling story. Jake Morrison stood behind his grandfather's shooting position, amazed by the transformation he was witnessing. The man he had dismissed just months earlier as past his prime was demonstrating skills that even the current generation of shooters respected. Jake felt a mixture of pride and embarrassment, remembering his casual comment about modern shooters being superior to the older generation. The range officer called for the final relay to begin. Shooters would have 45 minutes to fire 15 shots at targets 600 yards away. Scoring would be brutal. Anything outside the 8 ring would result in significant point deductions, and misses would essentially eliminate any chance of winning the overall competition. Harold settled into his familiar shooting position, his body naturally finding the comfortable alignment that had become second nature over decades of practice. Through his scope, the target appeared smaller than he remembered from his competitive days, but his vision was still clear enough to make out the scoring rings. The first shots from other competitors echoed across the range as Harold continued to study the wind conditions. He watched 3 complete wind cycles, noting how the gusts affected the flags at different distances. Only when he was confident in his read did he load his first round. Harold's opening shot felt perfect from the moment it left the barrel. The bullet struck the 9 ring just outside the 10 but well within the high-scoring area. Around him, other competitors were firing more rapidly, trying to take advantage of favorable wind conditions when they appeared. Marcus had started strongly, with his first 3 shots clustered in the 10 ring. His expensive ballistic computer was providing real-time wind solutions, and his precise shooting technique was executing those solutions flawlessly. But Harold noticed that Marcus was relying heavily on his technology, rather than developing an intuitive feel for the conditions. By the halfway point of the relay, Harold had fired 8 shots with remarkable consistency. 7 had hit the 9 ring or better, with 1 10 ring to show for his patient approach. He was keeping pace with the top competitors while shooting significantly slower than anyone else in his relay. The wind began to shift more dramatically as the afternoon wore on. What had been relatively predictable gusts became chaotic and unpredictable swirls. Harold watched several competitors struggle with shots that went wide as their wind corrections proved inadequate for the changing conditions. Sarah Rodriguez was having particular difficulty. Her shots scattered across the target as she struggled to keep up with the shifting winds. Her frustration was evident as she consulted her wind meter repeatedly between shots, trying to find a technological solution to what was becoming a purely intuitive challenge. Harold's 9th shot hit the 10 ring dead center, drawing an appreciative murmur from the spectators who were following his progress through spotting scopes. His consistency was becoming legendary, with nearly every shot finding the high-scoring rings despite the challenging conditions. How is he doing that? One of the younger competitors asked his coach. His equipment looks like it belongs in a museum, but he's out shooting guys with $50,000 worth of gear. Marcus Chen was feeling the pressure now. His computer-aided approach was failing him, as the wind became too chaotic for technological prediction. His last 3 shots had drifted into the 8 ring. Still respectable scores, but not the perfection needed to maintain his lead. With 5 shots remaining, Harold was within striking distance of the overall lead. The mathematical possibilities were complex, but everyone at the range understood that the final shots would determine not just the long-range event winner, but the overall competition champion. Harold's deliberate pace meant that other competitors finished before him, leaving him alone on the firing line for his final shots. The entire range fell silent except for the wind whistling through the target frames and the distant sound of traffic from the highway beyond the range property. The silence at the range was profound as Harold prepared for his final 5 shots. Every spectator, competitor, and range official understood they were witnessing something special. The pressure was immense, but Harold had learned long ago to use pressure as an ally rather than an enemy. He closed his eyes briefly, centering himself in the way he had done thousands of times before. When he opened them, the world seemed clearer, more focused. The chattering voices in his mind quieted, leaving only the essential information: wind speed, direction, target distance, and the feel of his rifle in his hands. Harold's 11th shot took nearly 3 minutes to execute. He waited through 2 complete wind cycles, letting gusts pass that would have sent his bullet wide of the target. When the conditions finally aligned with his mental picture of the perfect shot, he pressed the trigger with the same smooth motion he had perfected decades ago. The bullet struck the 10 ring slightly left of center. Still a perfect score, but not quite the precision Harold was capable of achieving. He made a mental note of the slight error and adjusted his wind reading for the next shot. Marcus Chen stood behind the firing line, watching Harold with growing amazement and concern. The defending champion had finished his relay with a respectable score, but it was becoming clear that it might not be enough. Harold's methodical consistency was producing results that even Marcus's high-tech approach couldn't match. "I've never seen anything like this," Marcus whispered to his coach. "He's reading conditions better than my ballistic computer, and he's doing it with equipment that's older than I am." Harold's 12th shot was delayed by a particularly challenging wind sequence. Gusts were coming from multiple directions, creating swirls and eddies that would confuse even the most sophisticated measuring equipment. Harold waited patiently, watching the grass and flags at different distances until he could predict the wind's behavior with confidence. When he finally fired, the shot felt slightly rushed. Harold knew immediately that it wasn't his best effort, and his assessment proved correct when the spotting scope revealed a hit in the 8 ring. Still a scoring shot, but the kind of error that could cost him the overall victory. The crowd pressed closer to the firing line, many using binoculars and spotting scopes to follow Harold's progress. Jake Morrison stood directly behind his grandfather, amazed by the concentration and skill he was witnessing. This was a side of Harold that Jake had heard about in family stories but had never seen firsthand. 3 shots remained, and Harold could feel fatigue beginning to affect his performance. His shoulders ached from holding the shooting position for extended periods, and his eyes were straining from hours of precise focus through the rifle scope. But his mind remained clear, drawing on reserves of mental toughness that had been built over a lifetime of competition. Harold's 13th shot required the longest wait of the entire relay. The wind conditions were chaotic, with gusts coming from seemingly random directions. Lesser shooters would have forced a shot through the difficult conditions, but Harold had learned patience through decades of experience. He waited nearly 4 minutes before the wind settled into a pattern he could predict. The shot broke cleanly, and Harold watched through his scope as the bullet struck the target. The spotting scope operator called out the result: 10 ring high center. The crowd erupted in appreciative applause, understanding that they had just witnessed a masterpiece of marksmanship. 2 shots remained, and Harold was now shooting for more than just personal satisfaction. He was representing every older competitor who had ever been dismissed because of their age, every traditional shooter who had been told their methods were obsolete, and every person who had ever been underestimated because they didn't have the latest equipment. The pressure was enormous, but Harold found himself smiling as he prepared for his 14th shot. This was why he had fallen in love with competitive shooting 50 years ago. The pure challenge of man against target, skill against difficulty, experience against uncertainty. Harold's 14th shot came together perfectly. The wind conditions were favorable, his position felt solid, and his sight picture was crystal clear. When the trigger broke, Harold knew he had fired one of the best shots of his career. The bullet struck the X-ring, the innermost portion of the 10-ring reserved for shots of exceptional precision. One shot remained. Harold was now in position to win not just the long-range event, but the overall competition. The mathematical calculations were complex, but the simple truth was clear. If he could deliver one more precise shot, Harold Morrison would defeat the best marksman in the state using a rifle older than most of his competitors. The wind had calmed slightly as evening approached, but Harold knew better than to trust apparent calm at long range. He studied the conditions with the intensity of a scientist, reading subtle clues that others might miss. The grass movement at 400 yards suggested a gentle left-to-right breeze. The flag at 500 yards was hanging limp, indicating no wind at that distance. But Harold noticed a slight mirage effect in his scope that suggested thermal currents that could affect his bullet's path. Harold settled into his final shooting position with the deliberate care of a surgeon preparing for a critical operation. Every aspect of his setup was checked and rechecked: his breathing, his sight picture, his trigger finger placement, and his mental state. This was the shot that would define not just the competition, but Harold's return to the sport he loved. The entire range held its breath as Harold began his trigger press. 50 years of experience guided his finger as it applied steady, increasing pressure to the trigger. The world narrowed to just Harold, his rifle, and the distant target that would determine his fate. The trigger broke with a crisp snap that Harold felt rather than heard. The recoil pushed gently against his shoulder, and through his scope he watched the bullet's trace as it arced toward the distant target. Time seemed suspended in those brief moments as 600 yards of air carried his final shot toward its destination. Harold remained motionless in his shooting position, knowing that following through was as important as the shot itself. He watched through his scope as the bullet struck the target, but the distance made it impossible to determine exactly where the hit had occurred. The suspense was agonizing as the range officials prepared to score the target. Behind the firing line, the crowd was completely silent. Spectators strained to see through binoculars and spotting scopes, but the target was too distant for anyone except the official scorers to determine the precise result. Harold slowly stood up from his shooting position, feeling the full weight of his 75 years in his aching joints and muscles. Jake Morrison placed a hand on his grandfather's shoulder. "That was incredible, Granddad. Whatever happens with the scoring, that was some of the finest shooting I've ever seen." Harold nodded appreciatively but remained focused on the target pit where officials were examining his final shot. Everything he had worked for over the past decade away from competition, all the questions about whether age had diminished his abilities, and the challenge to prove that experience could compete with youth and technology. It all came down to this one shot. Marcus Chen approached Harold with genuine respect in his voice. "Sir, regardless of how this turns out, you've earned the admiration of every shooter here today. I've learned more about reading wind conditions by watching you than I have from years of using computers." The target was finally pulled from the frame and carried to the scoring table. Range officials huddled around it, examining the bullet hole with magnifying glasses and measuring tools. The scoring process seemed to take forever, though it was probably only a few minutes. Harold felt surprisingly calm as he waited for the results. He had given everything he had to give, using every skill and bit of knowledge accumulated over a lifetime of shooting. Whether it was enough to win the competition mattered less than the fact that he had proven to himself that age was just a number when it came to the things that truly mattered. Sarah Rodriguez joined the group around Harold, her earlier competitiveness replaced by admiration. "Mr. Morrison, I owe you an apology. When I saw your equipment this morning, I thought you were just another old-timer who didn't know when to quit. You've shown all of us what real marksmanship looks like." The range officer finally approached the microphone to announce the results. "Ladies and gentlemen, after official scoring of the final target, Harold Morrison's last shot scored a perfect 10 X-ring center. His overall score gives him first place in the long-range precision event and, pending final calculations, the overall competition championship." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Harold felt a wave of emotion wash over him as the reality of what he had accomplished began to sink in. He had not only competed successfully against shooters half his age, but he had defeated them using skills and equipment that many considered obsolete. Competitors who had dismissed him that morning were now lining up to congratulate him and ask questions about his techniques. The young woman with purple hair who had registered him for the competition approached with a sheepish grin. "Mr. Morrison, I have to apologize for my attitude this morning. I've been working at shooting ranges for 5 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did today. Would you mind signing a target for me?" Harold graciously accepted the congratulations while remaining characteristically modest about his achievement. "I just did what I've been doing for 50 years, he told the gathering crowd. The fundamentals of marksmanship haven't changed even if the equipment has gotten fancier. But privately, Harold felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond winning a shooting competition. He had answered the question that had been nagging at him since his grandson's casual comment about modern shooters being superior to the older generation. Age might have slowed his reflexes and stiffened his joints, but it had also provided him with something that couldn't be purchased or downloaded: wisdom earned through decades of experience. The official results were posted an hour later, confirming Harold's overall victory. His combined scores across all 3 events had given him a narrow but decisive win over Marcus Chen, with Sarah Rodriguez finishing 3rd. The margin of victory was just 7 points out of nearly 1/800 possible. But in competitive shooting, a win was a win regardless of the margin. As Harold packed his equipment for the final time that day, he was approached by a reporter from the local newspaper who had heard about the unusual competition results. "Mr. Morrison, what would you say to other older athletes who might think their competitive days are behind them?" Harold considered the question carefully as he cleaned his rifle one last time. "I'd tell them that age is just one factor in any competition. Experience, knowledge, and mental toughness can compensate for a lot of physical limitations. But mostly I'd tell them that it's never too late to prove to yourself what you're still capable of achieving." The parking lot was nearly empty by the time Harold loaded his equipment into his pickup truck. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the range where he had just experienced one of the most satisfying days of his long life. 3 weeks after his stunning victory at the Riverside shooting range, Harold Morrison found his quiet retirement had become anything but peaceful. The story of the 75-year-old marksman who had defeated the state's best shooters with a vintage rifle had spread far beyond the local shooting community. National shooting magazines requested interviews, and equipment manufacturers wanted to sponsor him. Harold politely declined most of the attention, preferring to return to his simple life of farming and fishing. But he couldn't ignore the impact his victory had on the broader shooting community, and more importantly, on his own family. Jake Morrison had called his grandfather every few days since the competition, wanting to hear more details about Harold's shooting career and the techniques he had used. The conversation that had started months earlier about modern shooters being superior to older generations had been completely reversed. "Granddad, I've been thinking about what happened at the range," Jake said during one of their phone conversations. "I realize now that I was confusing technology with skill. You showed me that fundamental marksmanship is still the most important factor in competitive shooting." Harold was pleased by his grandson's change in perspective, but he was careful not to dismiss the value of modern equipment and training methods. "Technology can definitely help, Jake, but it's only as good as the person using it. The best equipment in the world can't replace practice, patience, and understanding of the fundamentals." The victory had also inspired other older competitors to return to shooting sports. Harold received letters from former marksmen across the country who had been motivated by his story to dust off their rifles and consider competing again. Several shooting clubs organized senior shooter events, creating opportunities for older competitors to participate without having to compete directly against athletes in their prime. Marcus Chen, the former state champion whom Harold had defeated, became an unexpected friend and student. Marcus visited Harold's farm several times, eager to learn the wind-reading techniques that had proven so effective at the competition. Their shooting sessions became lessons in how traditional skills could complement modern technology. "I've been relying too heavily on my ballistic computer," Marcus admitted during one of their practice sessions. "When the conditions became too complex for the computer to handle accurately, I didn't have the instincts to fall back on. You've shown me that understanding the fundamentals is still the foundation of good shooting." Harold enjoyed teaching the younger shooter, finding satisfaction in passing on knowledge that might otherwise be lost as older competitors retired. Their friendship bridged the generational gap that had seemed so significant just months earlier. Sarah Rodriguez also became a regular visitor to Harold's farm, bringing other young shooters who wanted to learn traditional marksmanship techniques. Harold's informal shooting school grew into a small but dedicated group of students who appreciated learning methods that had been proven over decades of competition. The media attention gradually died down, but Harold's reputation in the shooting community remained elevated. He was invited to serve as a judge at major competitions and to write articles for shooting publications about traditional marksmanship techniques. Harold accepted some of these opportunities, viewing them as chances to educate rather than to promote himself. But perhaps the most meaningful change in Harold's life was the transformation in his relationship with Jake. His grandson began visiting the farm regularly, not just to learn about shooting, but to spend time with a man he had come to respect in an entirely new way. "I never really understood what you accomplished during your competitive career," Jake told his grandfather during one visit. "The trophies in your den were just old metal to me. Now I realize they represent decades of dedication and skill that I completely underestimated." Harold appreciated his grandson's newfound respect, but he was more interested in building their relationship going forward than dwelling on past accomplishments. They began planning hunting trips together, and Jake expressed interest in learning about Harold's other skills, including the farming and mechanical work that had occupied his retirement years. 6 months after the competition, Harold received an invitation that surprised him. The National Shooting Sports Foundation wanted him to participate in a documentary about the evolution of competitive shooting. The project would showcase how traditional skills remained relevant in the modern era, using Harold's story as a central example. Harold initially hesitated to participate, uncomfortable with the level of attention the documentary might bring. But after discussions with his family and students, he agreed to take part, recognizing that his story could inspire other older athletes and preserve important knowledge about traditional marksmanship. The documentary filming brought Harold full circle, back to the Riverside shooting range where his legendary performance had taken place. This time, however, he wasn't competing against younger shooters, but teaching them. The cameras captured Harold working with Marcus, Sarah, and several other competitors, demonstrating wind-reading techniques and explaining the mental aspects of precision shooting. "The most important thing I learned from Mr. Morrison," Marcus told the documentary cameras, "is that competitive shooting isn't just about having the best equipment. It's about understanding your craft so deeply that you can perform under any conditions." As the documentary wrapped up production, Harold reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a simple desire to prove he wasn't past his prime. His victory at the competition had been satisfying, but the relationships he had built and the knowledge he had shared proved far more meaningful than any trophy. Harold continued to compete occasionally at local events, though he never again achieved the dramatic success of that first day back. But winning had never really been the point. He had proven to himself and others that experience, wisdom, and dedication could triumph over youth and technology when the fundamentals were properly applied. Standing in his workshop on a quiet evening, cleaning the same Winchester rifle that had carried him to victory, Harold Morrison smiled at the irony of his situation. He had returned to competitive shooting to prove he wasn't too old, only to discover that age had actually been one of his greatest advantages. The patience, wisdom, and mental toughness that came with 75 years of living had made him a better shooter than he had been in his supposed prime. The legend had indeed returned, but more importantly, it had never really left.